over the past couple of weeks, I administered a variety of reading tests to Matt. I administered the QRI and DeBell's test, and essentially what these tests do is they ask students to read a list of words out of context, and also they'll put those words in a passage and ask them to read the passage and then answer questions about them. So I administered a couple different versions of these tests to him, and afterwards I determined that his areas of strengths were that he was really good with word recognition, both in and out of context. He could pronounce the majority of the words, and he was able to read at a really good rate with fluency and expression, but he really struggled in the area of comprehension. When I asked him questions about both narrative and expository text, when I asked him both explicit and implicit questions, he struggled with answering those questions. And as you see, you have him in class, he's a really great reader. He just really struggles with the comprehension and being able to answer questions about the text. So that's the area that I wanted to focus on with my professional development strategy, and a strategy to specifically help Matt. So I did some research, and I found this strategy called the TWA strategy. And I had never heard of it before, but it sounded really interesting, and it sounded like it would actually really help Matt because it's very structured, very organized. It breaks it down into 9 parts, and even further so 3 parts. And I think it would be good for him because he seems to be a very organized, structured person. And it really focuses on making a connection with the text, forging a relationship with the text, and focuses overall on comprehension, which was the area that he was struggling in. So, like I said, it's a reading comprehension strategy. It focuses on fostering independence in reading. It's a self-regulated reading strategy, so it focuses on students being able to make connections with the text, being able to practice their metacognitive skills, so thinking about their own thinking about the author's thinking from a variety of different perspectives. I also thought this strategy would be good not just for Matt, but it can be used in a whole class instruction, small group instruction, whether it be partner work or a group of 3 or 4 people, or just the whole class. I think this would be helpful if I just taught Matt one-on-one, but I think it would also be helpful for all the SOAR students. Also, it's proven to be highly effective by many studies, some of which I have listed here, which is always good. So, what is TWA? So it is an acronym or a mnemonic device that stands for T being think before you read, W meaning think while you read, and A meaning think after you read. Now, when I first stumbled upon this strategy, it reminded me a lot of something I did in high school called the KWL chart. K being what you know, W being what you want to know, and L being what you learned after you've read. And it kind of focuses on having that relationship of here's my background knowledge, applying that background knowledge to the passage that I'm reading, and then being able to answer questions after I've read. So it's a whole process, and I think that's really important for reading, because reading is not just the moments where you are, reading the words on a page. It's very much beforehand and afterhand, and I like that this strategy focuses reading as a whole process, and I think that's really important. So I want to break it down into 9 parts because that's what it is. There's 3 parts broken down into 3 subparts, so 9 total. First being the think before you read, which asks students to first identify the author's purpose, which is obviously going to be hard to do before they read, but they're going to be looking at the title and thinking, okay, if this article is about Martin Luther King, why would a author write about Martin Luther King? So it asks students to make educated guesses about what they're going to read, and then eventually when they get to part 3, they can compare, God bless you, they can compare what they had thought might be the purpose to what they actually think the purpose is after they read. So it's all interconnected. Second being reflecting on what you know, or their background knowledge, which is super, super important, because I found with Matt, with this test, before he read passages, I would ask him questions to indicate his familiarity on the topic, and I found that he did way better on passages that he was familiar with versus passages he was unfamiliar with. So if a student, before they read, establishes their background knowledge, they can determine, am I familiar with this topic? And that familiarity really establishes comfort. And I think with reading, it can be an uncomfortable thing if you are completely unfamiliar with the topic. And then finally, determining what you want to learn. Like I said, this is similar to the KWL chart in that it asks the students to establish a goal. What do I want out of this? What do I want to learn after I finish this reading? Second part is occurring while you're reading, so thinking while you read. First, it asks students to monitor their reading speed, which I think is super important because a lot of students read too quickly and a lot of students read too slowly, and both are a problem. If they read too quickly, they might miss information and stumble over their words. If they read too slowly, it can become cumbersome and overwhelming. So they really want to focus on finding that middle ground, and it's not necessarily about timing necessarily. You're not asking students to take out a stopwatch, time themselves while they read, but just to be cognizant of the rate at which they're reading. Second being connecting what they already know to what they're reading, and that's connected to the first part in that they're taking that background knowledge and applying it to what they read. And then finally, rereading parts that are confusing, which again I think is super important because a lot of times students think, okay, I need to read this piece of information once and be able to answer every single question about that, because that's kind of the high stakes nature of school sometimes. But I think they need to understand that, you know, even us as adults and teachers, we read things dozens of times before we fully understand them. So I think I really was drawn to this strategy because it does not expect students to get things perfect the first try. They can reread and try to understand things better. And then finally, it's the post-reading process, the thinking after you read. And that asks students to establish a main idea, which is super important because a lot of times students get lost in all the details and they have a hard time figuring out what's important versus not important. And also it asks students to summarize that main information. So you may ask your students to write a short paragraph after they read, or be able to write some bullet points about the summary. And then finally, the reflection. So they might reflect on the author's purpose or reflect on what they wanted to learn versus what they did learn. Just, it's all a cohesive process, and that's what really drew me to this strategy, and what also made me think that MAP would also benefit from this strategy. So if you were to actually implement this strategy in your classroom, how would you go about it? I think with introducing any sort of strategy in your classroom, it can be overwhelming to students because it's totally different from the way they're used to doing things. So I think it's best to phrase it as maybe a helpful trick to help them, better their reading. And don't approach it in a way that's like a problem solution kind of form. Don't say, you're bad at reading, this is gonna help you be better. Say, you're a great reader, you can be an even better reader if you try this. Try to be positive about it. Also, I suggest that it be a multiple day process. It's kind of a lengthy thing. It's 9 bullet points. Sometimes certain students can get overwhelmed by all of that information. So in a couple slides, you'll see I broke it down to be a 4-day lesson plan. I think it's also so important for teachers to model strategies. You can't just give them a piece of paper and say, this is what you do. Do it. You got to show them, because a lot of kids are visual learners, auditory learners. It's so helpful to be able to see someone who knows what they're doing model it right in front of them. And then finally, I think the use of graphic organizers is so important because, again, it really helps those visual learners be able to break things down. So you could use a KWL chart, or I made this specific TWA chart, which I think is super helpful because you can make this and give it to your students, or it's something that you guys can make together as you're teaching the strategy to them. For our students, it might be helpful to print this out and give it to them beforehand. But for a more advanced class, as you're teaching this strategy, they can create this on their own so they can visualize it themselves. But I think for our class, it might be important to give it to them first, and then maybe they can create their own version for what's most helpful for them. So, if you were to hypothetically introduce the strategy in your own classroom, what would it look like? I outlined a 4-day lesson plan for you. So day 1, You're obviously going to introduce the strategy. Sometimes that can be a little overwhelming, so you want to be able to break it down into manageable chunks. You might also want to discuss what an acronym is, what a mnemonic device is, because they might say TWA, what does that mean? You want to break it down into the, what do these words mean? I also think it's super helpful to use analogies, so I'm going to talk about the analogy of flying a plane or a pilot, which is kind of relevant to this class because we just did the flying simulator. So I think it's just helpful to take something and to be able to use an analogy to make it a little bit more understandable. So if you're starting with the idea of thinking before reading, you're going to introduce that. You're going to introduce the aspect of the author's purpose. So if you're looking at why did an author write a book, you might be able to connect that to why did a pilot fly a plane? Where is he going? That, before reading, before flying, make that connection. And then you have the background knowledge, and you can connect that to how a pilot uses his background knowledge of routes in order to get from point A to point B. So we're using this analogy to foster their understanding of what this strategy will actually look like. And then you'll introduce the idea of what they want to learn and can connect that to how a pilot will want to know about the weather or other planes or other certain details that will be important when he, steps in the plane and begins to fly. Then you'll introduce the 3 parts of thinking while reading. So you can talk about the reading speed and how that's important, and you can talk about the fact that, don't read too quickly, don't read too slowly. It's finding that perfect balance. Obviously, a pilot must constantly monitor their speed. They can't go too quickly if it's too dangerous. If they go too slowly, they won't get to their destination on time. So really emphasizing that analogy, I think, is going to be helpful for them. You talk about linking background information by connecting it to the fact that pilots must use their knowledge while flying, just like readers must use their knowledge while reading. And then finally, rereading confusing parts. If a pilot was to read something on an instructional manual and not understand it, he would read it again. Just like if a reader were to read something and not understand it, you would want to read it again. Finally, we have the 3 parts of thinking after you read. So looking at the main idea, you can connect this to how the first thing pilots do when they land is write in their pilot log. So they might write about the type of plane that they flew, where they started, where they landed, details like that. And then we have the idea of summarizing, and you can connect that to how pilots may add details in their logs, such as the weather, passenger details, how long it took to get to point A to point B, something like that. Again, just fostering that analogy. And then finally, the reflection. You can connect that to how pilots get together and tell stories about their adventures and whatnot. So this is just day 1, just introducing the strategy, making the connection of the pilot flying a plane. While you're introducing this strategy, you can either hand out that graphic organizer that I made, or the students can make it themselves to break it down into 9 parts, just to be familiar with, okay, what does TWA mean? What does it mean to think before you read? What does it mean to think while you're reading? What does it mean to think after you read? And each part. Okay, so day 2 will be a little bit more intensive, and that you're actually going to be using the strategy. But I don't think it's best for the students to dive headfirst into the strategy. Like I said earlier, I think it's best for the teacher to model it first. So I think the teacher should model the strategy with an easier level passage. You might want to choose a passage that's 1 to 2 grade levels below what your students are capable of reading. Because obviously you don't want to model a strategy with a really, really complex text, because you're adding the element of difficulty of not only the strategy, but the difficulty of the text itself. So use the text that the class is familiar with, or use the text that they've read before, and model the strategy with that. This way, they're more focused on the strategy itself, less than the content of the passage. And like I said, make sure that they're using those graphic organizers, because that's what's going to be helpful to them. So like I said, either they could use the one that you provided for them, or if they feel more comfortable using one that they made, obviously it's at the discretion of your students. And then finally, this is best practice for any teacher, ensure comprehension by allowing students to ask questions during your lesson. If a student seems confused or like they're not following along, take a pause, because it is kind of a cumbersome thing. So, and don't just wait for them to ask questions, ask them questions too, to make sure that, that they're understanding. Use that formative assessment as a way of gauging their understanding. Don't just assume that they're getting it. And then finally, days 3 and 4, depending on how long it'll take you, I think it's best to move into either partner work or independent work, depending on if your students get it or not. I think it's best to do partner work because it's less intimidating. You have a buddy to help you along. You can, bring your brains together and work on this project. So, with the first time that they're encountering the strategy, I think it's best to do easier passages, even if you are with a partner, because it really is focusing on the execution of the strategy and less on the passage itself. And then eventually the goal would be for students to do it independently. So if you can't have time in class, maybe that's a good homework assignment. Give them a 1-page passage and ask them to try the TWA strategy out for themselves. And then obviously discussion is huge. After they've completed this, maybe have them write a reflection on it and see if it's helpful. Because if you spent all this time teaching something and it doesn't help them, that's okay, because there's so many other strategies out there, but you don't want to continue doing something if it's not helping them,
right. It helps one of them out of 8, that's good.
Yeah. So, but you have to determine whether it's worth it.
Absolutely.
If it's helping none of them, and it's, it seems to make sense to you, but it's not making sense to them, then it's really not worth your time. So be honest with your students, have your students be honest with you. Maybe they want to write an anonymous letter or something, anonymous reflection talking about the strategy, so they, can feel comfortable sharing their opinions. But yeah, I think fostering a good discussion is always super important in the classroom. And then finally, specifically, why do I think the strategy will help Matt? Like I said, he was a really, really great reader in terms of fluency and word recognition, but his comprehension was really, really low. So I think this strategy would really help him because it focuses on comprehension in any sort of passage, expository and narrative text. It won't just work if you're reading it. It will work for both novels or textbooks, things like that. So also I think it's important because it emphasizes the fact that reading should be meaningful. You're supposed to have a relationship with reading. And finally, it allows the opportunities to look back and have a relationship with the text and not just, read something once and have all the answers. And it makes reading less intimidating. It breaks it down into more manageable chunks and hopefully, makes it an organized process that when they look at a text, they're not scared. They know exactly what they're going to do and how to approach it in a way that's meaningful and organized. And that's it. You're my works consultant. Do you have any questions?
Not really. I really like that strategy, and I think that we should try it.
Sure.
Would you like to present it to the class?
Maybe.
It's good.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
We're going to
I
stop
like it.
recording.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, yes.